The first thing Sergeant Dario Orella noticed when he came back to consciousness was the smell. Not blood, he was used to blood, had catalogued its rust-iron bite across 15 years of Buenos Aires street work, but something chemical and cold underneath it. Something that didn't belong to a human body or a crime scene. Something that belonged to a lab. He was on his side on a concrete floor. His mouth tasted like copper, and the back of his head pulsed with a slow, ugly throb that told him he'd been hit by something heavy and swung by someone who knew what they were doing. He lay still for 6 full seconds before he moved. 15 years had taught him that the room was a loading bay. Fluorescent tubes, 2 of them dead, 1 flickering. Pallets of shrink-wrapped goods stacked against one wall. Metal shelving units bolted to another. A steel door at the far end with a keypad panel beside it. No windows. The building had the acoustic quality of concrete poured thick. The city sound was completely gone, which meant either deep interior or underground, and his legs were still there and still bent wrong from where he'd landed. So probably interior. He sat up. His service weapon was missing. So was his radio and his phone. His badge was still clipped to his belt, for whatever that was worth. "You're awake," said a voice from the shadows near the shelving. "Good. I was starting to think they'd killed you." Orella turned his head slowly. Sitting on an overturned plastic crate, arms folded across his chest, was Corporal Tony Kayalot. 3 years ago, they'd worked the same district. 3 years ago, Orella had filed a formal complaint against Kayalot for conduct unbecoming, and Kayalot had filed one against him for negligence, and their commanding officer had transferred Kayalot across the city to make it stop. In the 2 years since, they had not spoken directly once. "Kayalot," Orella said. "Orella," Kayalot said. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "You were following me," Orella said finally. "I was not following you. I was on my own surveillance. You happened to walk into my surveillance. I was on a tip. A building on Cayunzue. Possible trafficking operation." "Yes," Kayalot said. "That was my building." Orella looked at the ceiling, then looked back at Kayalot. "How many are there? I counted 6 before they put me in here, armed, minimum. And they have something else." Kayalot paused. He was not a man who paused easily. He was a man who talked too much and moved too fast, and took credit for things he hadn't done, which was one of the reasons Orella had filed the complaint. The pause was not like him. "Something I can't explain. Try. When they brought me in, 2 of them walked me through the 4th floor. I saw a room. Through a window in the door." He stopped again. "Kayalot, there were bodies in there. 3, 4 bodies on tables. But they weren't dead. The way they were moving, it was wrong. Like someone had taken a person and replaced most of them with something that almost knew how to be a person, but not quite. They were strapped down and they had tubing running in and out of them, in places that—" He shook his head. "The eyes were wrong. The faces were wrong. And there was a woman running the room, supervising, and she looked at me through the glass like I was nothing. Not a cop. Not a person. An inconvenience." Orella sat with this. He was not an imaginative man by nature. He'd become a cop because the structure suited him and the work was real, and you could measure it in cases closed and people home safe. He liked things he could put in a report. What Kayalot was describing did not go in a report. Not any report he knew how to write. "Android," he said. Kayalot blinked. "What?" "They're experimenting with androids. I've heard whispers. 6 months ago, a case up in San Telmo. 3 bodies found with surgical scarring in places that didn't correspond to any medical procedure on record. And there was talk from informants about a group running biological integration. Trafficking the product inside living hosts, not balloons in the stomach. Inside the body chemistry. Using modified tissue. That's insane." "Yes," Orella said. "That's why it was only whispers." He got to his feet, his head protested. He ignored it, the way he ignored most things that protested, which was completely. "There's no way out of this room," Kayalot said. "I checked while you were out. The door's keypad locked from outside. There's no ventilation shaft big enough for a person, and the shelves are bolted." "The shelves are bolted to the wall," Orella said, "not the floor." He walked to the shelving units and crouched down, examining the base brackets. Steel bolts through concrete anchors, 4 per unit. He looked at the shelving unit itself. Standard industrial, the kind you found in any warehouse in the city, the kind that was assembled from modular components. "Help me with this." "With what?" "We can't go through the wall." "Not the wall." He pointed at the door. "The keypad panel is mounted at shoulder height. Someone mounted it from this side of the door before this room was as a prison. Look at the faceplate." Kayalot looked. There was a gap, maybe half a centimeter, between the keypad housing and the wall. The housing had been surface-mounted, not recessed. The wiring was behind the wall, but the override mechanism, the simple brake circuit that any generic industrial keypad used as a failsafe, would be inside that housing. Kyle was quiet for a moment. "You've broken into a lot of keypad rooms?" "I've worked a lot of break-ins," Orella said. He wasn't going to explain it further than that. They dismantled the second shelf tier and worked one of the metal uprights free. It took 11 minutes, and Orella scraped 2 knuckles down to the bone, but he registered the pain the way you register weather, as a condition, not a problem. The upright was 1.5 centimeters of tubular steel, roughly 90 centimeters long, sufficient. Getting the keypad housing off the wall took 3 more minutes, a lot of leverage, and one moment where Kyle's face went very still, and he said very quietly, "Someone's in the corridor," and they both stopped breathing. Footsteps. Irregular cadence, not quite human, not limping, just slightly wrong in its timing, like a recording of walking played back at 95% speed. The footsteps passed. They waited 30 seconds after the last sound. "One of them," Kyle said. "Yes," Orella said. He finished working the housing off. The wiring inside was exactly what he'd expected. A circuit board, 2 relays, a simple brake contact lead that would trigger the door release. He crossed the leads with the end of the metal upright. The door clicked. They stood on either side of the door frame for a moment, before pushing through, the way you did when you didn't know what was on the other side. It was the first thing Orella remembered about Kyle that wasn't aggravating. He'd done it automatically. Moved to position without being told. The ingrained reflex of someone who'd come through the same doors that Orella had come through. Bad doors. Doors you didn't know what was behind. The corridor was empty. Concrete walls, bare bulbs on a cable. Doors at intervals, each keypad locked. At the far end, a stairwell. The building had, from what Orella could tell, at least 6 floors above them. They were on the ground floor or the first. The loading bay suggested ground-level access. "We need weapons," Kyle said. "We need to understand what's here," Orella said. "That's the same thing." "No, it isn't." He turned to look at Kyle fully. In the bad light, the man looked older than he'd remembered. Not softer, just more worn. The complaint between them sat in the air between them like furniture neither of them had moved out yet. "How many floors did they take you through?" 4. "They had me in an elevator. The building goes up to at least 6, I saw the panel. Then we go up, quietly. We get a picture of what's here, then we find a way to signal outside, then we get out. And if we can't signal outside, then we improvise," Orella said, and started for the stairwell. The second floor was storage. Chemical drums, some labeled in Spanish, and some in what looked like a Cyrillic-adjacent script that Orella didn't recognize. Refrigerated units humming along one wall. The smell here was stronger, that cold chemical quality, antiseptic, but not hospital clean. Something with an organic base underneath it. Orella photographed it in his mind, the way he photographed crime scenes, methodically, sectors nothing skipped. The third floor was offices. 3 people visible through the internal glass partitions. 2 of them moved wrong. Not injured wrong, not drunk wrong. Wrong in the fundamental sense. The way an imitation is always subtly wrong, even when the craftwork is excellent. Something in the micro-timing of gestures. Something in the eye movement. Something you couldn't point to directly, but that your nervous system understood before your brain did. They were seated at desks, running what appeared to be communication equipment. One was typing. The other appeared to be monitoring a screen. The third one was human. Orella was certain of it the way you became certain of certain things after long enough in the work. She was in her 40s, compact dark hair pulled back, and she was reviewing a printed document at a desk in the corner office. She had the focused stillness of someone who was in charge and knew it, and had stopped needing to perform it. "Avalana," Kyle breathed. "You know her?" "She's in 3 case files that I know of. Trafficking. 2 dismissed on procedural, 1 never went to charge." He paused. "She's the one who was looking at me through the glass." Orella watched her for another 30 seconds. She turned a page. She picked up a pen and made a notation without looking up. She was not concerned about the building's security, because the building's security had never failed before, and because she had resources that the people who usually threatened her security did not have. He understood that much just from how she sat. They moved past the 3rd floor without going in. The 4th floor was where Kyle's face had gone wrong with the telling of it. Orella made himself look. 3 figures on the tables. Not 4, 3. But the tubing was as described, and the lighting was a specific clinical blue-white that hospitals used for reasons Orella had never understood. The figures moved occasionally. Not struggling, not in pain, or not in any pain they could express. Their faces had the quality of sleep interrupted halfway, an expression that began as one thing and couldn't resolve into another. The tubing ran from bracketed overhead lines into the inner arm, the neck, the base of the skull. A fourth figure stood in the far corner of the room facing the wall, motionless. It had its back to the window in the door, and everything about its posture was wrong in the way the third-floor operators were wrong, but concentrated, intensified, like a practice run that had gone too far and come out somewhere the practice run wasn't supposed to reach. Orella looked at all of it for 4 seconds, which was about all you could do with something you couldn't yet put in a report, and then he moved. The 5th floor had a radio room, unmanned, which told Orella they were understaffed for the size of the operation, which told him the operation was scaling up fast, which told him they were close to a production phase that would make everything harder to stop. The radio equipment was standard commercial. There was a satellite uplink unit in the corner. The frequency display was locked with a physical key. Kayalot reached into the neck of his shirt and produced a key card on a lanyard. "Took it off the man who knocked you out," he said. "Didn't know what it opened." Orella looked at him. Kayalot shrugged in that particular way he had that meant, "I'm not going to apologize for what I did, and you weren't going to thank me anyway." The key card opened the frequency lock. The equipment ran on a standard emergency band overlap, the kind that interacted with civil law enforcement channels as well as civilian broadcast. Orella sat down and began working the controls with the focused efficiency of a man who had needed to work equipment he wasn't trained on before, which was most of a cop's job if you were doing it right. "Can you reach them?" Kayalot asked. "Not a direct channel. I can get a message onto the emergency band. Anyone scanning it will pick it up." He started composing a burst signal, building address, police identification codes, 6 words that would tell anyone who knew the codes what the situation was. He keyed it. The equipment hummed. He keyed it again. The third time, a light on the panel flickered green. "Someone received it?" Kayalot said. "Someone's scanner registered the frequency. Whether they respond, I don't know. We need to assume we're doing this alone." "We've been alone this whole time, I know," Orella said. "I meant for the next part. They found weapons on the 5th floor too, in a lockup that the same key card opened. Not service weapons, nothing either of them were certified for, but functional. The kind of equipment that moved through trafficking operations the way equipment always did, through hands that had other things to worry about than the paperwork." Kayalot took a short-stock shotgun and a spare box of shells. Orella took a pistol that was a generation old and a tactical flashlight that was new enough to be useful. He also took a roll of copper wire from a shelf above the lockup, which Kayalot looked at but didn't ask about. "The woman," Orella said. "Avalana, she's the command node here. Not the operations head, too physical a presence for that, too hands-on, but the operational lead. If we take her out of play, the rest fractures. The ones who move wrong, they're dependent on the living operators. They can't make judgment calls. They can't adapt." "You've given this a lot of thought," Kayalot said. "I've been thinking since the loading bay, and how do we take her out of play? She has 6 armed guards, minimum, plus whatever those things on the 3rd floor are." "We use the building," Orella said. He looked around the 5th floor. The electrical conduit ran exposed along the ceiling. Not industrial best practice, but budget. The chemical drums on the 2nd floor, the refrigeration units, the satellite uplink they'd just transmitted through. "Every criminal enterprise that I've ever worked," he said, "builds its operation so that the building works for it. They use the architecture, the access points, the systems." He pulled a length of copper wire off the roll and held it between his hands. "So do we." They came down from the 5th floor a different way than they'd gone up. Not the main stairwell. There was a service shaft at the back of the building that accessed the electrical systems. Narrow, vertical, and not intended for human transit, but intended for the conduit runs, which meant brackets at intervals that you could use as ladder rungs if you were willing to do it with your arms and your trust in metal that hadn't been tested recently. Kayalot went first because Orella asked him to, and Kayalot didn't argue, which told Orella something had shifted between them that neither of them was going to mention directly. The 4th floor was what he needed, not the room with the figures on the tables. The junction panel on the east wall. The building's electrical distribution board for this floor. The clinical lighting in that room ran on a dedicated circuit, which meant you could isolate it, which meant you could kill it, which meant you could make whatever was standing motionless in the corner of that room dependent on God knew What kind of signal to maintain its stability? Have a problem. Kayalot kept watch at the stairwell entrance. Orella worked the panel. It was good work, the kind of work you could only do if you'd spent enough time in buildings that were held together, with a combination of code violations and optimism. The city had buildings like this, the way it had people like this. Functional beyond any reasonable expectation, stubborn in the ways that mattered. He crossed the dedicate circuit with a copper wire in a way that would create a feedback loop when activated. Not immediately, on a delay, because he needed the delay. He used the tactical flashlights clip to bridge a relay that would give him approximately 4 minutes. Then he went to find Avalana. She was still in the corner office on the 3rd floor. He came through the door fast and he had the pistol at arm's length before she could do anything, which she didn't do anyway. She looked at him the way she'd looked at Kayalot through the glass, as an inconvenience. That didn't change even when she saw the weapon. "Sergeant," she said. Not a guess. She'd known who he was since the loading bay. "On your feet," Orella said. "Hands where I can see them. We're going for a walk. The men on this floor are going to have other things to worry about in about 3 minutes," Orella said. He was counting down internally. Move. She moved. She did it the way someone moves who's calculating, not complying, every step a fraction of a second behind what it should be, a little too deliberate. She was looking for her moment. He'd worked enough of these to recognize it. He stayed close and kept the angle wrong for any kind of reversal. They came out of the office into the corridor. The 2 wrong-moving figures at their desks didn't look up. That, Orella noted, was information. They were not guards. They were processors. They were doing their function, and their function didn't include responding to the human moving through their space. Unless she told them to. "Don't," Orella said, reading her intake of breath. She didn't. Something in how he said it communicated that he'd anticipated it, which was the truth, and that changed her calculation. She was smart. She could see when a variable had been accounted for. Kayalot was at the stairwell, and he fell in on the other side of Avalana. Without a word, the shotgun angled low, and the 3 of them went up 2 floors to the radio room, because the radio room had a lockable door that could be locked from the inside. 60 seconds later, something on the 4th floor let go. It was electrical, a cascade noise, a pop and then a low hum that built and then cut. The building's lighting dipped and returned. In the room with the tables, the clinical blue-white would have gone dark. Whatever had been standing in the corner would have. "What did you do?" Avalana said. For the first time she sounded like someone who had encountered a variable they hadn't accounted for. "Something a person would do," Orella said. Below them, the building changed its acoustics. Voices, running feet, the irregular rhythm, that slightly wrong tempo. And then, from somewhere that might have been the ground floor, a sound that wasn't a voice and wasn't a machine, something in between, something that rose, and then stopped in the way that things stop when the thing making them is no longer operational. Avalana closed her for 1 second. She opened them. Whatever calculation she'd been running, she'd arrived at a conclusion. "The operation will continue," she said. "This is one site. I am one person. The infrastructure." "I know," Orella said. "I know that. That's not what tonight is about." He leaned against the doorframe and looked at her steadily. He had the pistol at his side now, not raised. "Tonight is about you going into a room and telling a lawyer everything you've just told me, which is true and which I understand, and every name that comes before the infrastructure. Tonight is about the chain going up, not what's already in place." She looked at him for a long time. He waited. Waiting was another of the things he'd gotten good at that didn't make the job easier, only possible. "The chain goes up a long way," she said. "Good," Orella said. "I've got nothing else scheduled." Kayalot looked between them. "This is insane," he said. "We're trapped in a building. We don't even know if anyone received the signal." "Someone did," Orella said. He didn't know that, but he'd sent it 3 times on the emergency band, and the acknowledgement light had gone green, and the rest was probability. And probability was the engine everything ran on, whether you admitted it or not. He was right, as it happened. But he wouldn't know that for another 18 minutes. What he knew in those 18 minutes. That the building had 6 floors, and approximately 12 people in it, of which roughly half were not people in any definable legal sense, and that the ones who were people were starting to understand that the 4th floor situation had changed the building's operational capacity in ways that made them a problem for each other. Criminal organizations were not usually very good at internal cohesion under pressure. They were good at operating in a stable environment with clear hierarchy. Remove the stability and the hierarchy becomes a question. Avalana, for her part, sat in the radio room chair and said nothing. She had the bearing of someone waiting out a hand they hadn't been dealt yet. Orella found himself respecting it in the way he sometimes respected things he would have preferred not to. Kyalot paced. 3 steps turn, 3 steps turn. He was a man who processed by moving, and the room wasn't giving him enough room to move. The complaint, Kyalot said. Orella didn't look up from watching the door. The one you filed, about the Recoleta incident. Yes, Orella said. I was trying to protect the witness. You were protecting your clearance rate, Orella said. You wanted the arrest on record before the DA's office moved. The witness was a secondary consideration. Kyalot stopped pacing. That's not, he stopped. He started again. Maybe that was part of it. But the witness was protected. The arrest went through. The arrest went through badly, Orella said. You know that, a long silence. From somewhere below them a door, heavy footsteps, then nothing. The complaint I filed, Kyalot said. About you, the Pomero case. Yes, Orella said. You let him walk. I let him walk that night, Orella said. Because he was going to lead us to the supplier, and you went in early, and the supplier never materialized, and we got one man with a possession charge that was pled down to community service. Yes, you should have told me. I did tell you, you didn't. He stopped himself, old territory, no different in daylight than it was in a locked room with armed people below them. I should have told you louder, he said instead. I should have made sure you understood what we were doing before we did it. Kyalot looked at him for a moment. Then he resumed pacing, but slower. The radio crackled. A burst signal, encoded law enforcement frequency. Orella was across the room in 2 steps. He responded with the acknowledgement code, and then the building address again, and the words hostile active police officers, on site, and then his badge number, and Kyalot's badge number. The radio was quiet for 4 seconds. Then confirmation codes. Unit en route estimated 9 minutes. 9 minutes, Kyalot said. Yes. We have to hold this room for 9 minutes. That's correct, Orella said. He went back to the door. 2 minutes later, footsteps in the corridor, 2 sets. The irregular rhythm of one, the heavier deliberate step of another. A human, one of the armed guards, working with one of the 3rd-floor operators. A search pattern. They were looking for Avalana most likely, or looking for what had caused the 4th-floor failure, or both. Orella looked at Avalana. If you call out, he said, I'll have a serious problem. And I'll have to do things in the next 9 minutes that I'd prefer not to do. She looked at him. That calculation again. Then she looked at her hands in her lap. The footsteps passed the door without stopping. Kyalot exhaled. He'd had the shotgun raised. He lowered it. When this is over, he said. Yes, Orella said. I'm going to buy you a drink. Orella looked at him. I don't drink. I'm going to buy you a coffee. I don't drink coffee either. Kyalot stared. What do you drink? Water, mostly. Mate occasionally. I'm going to buy you a mate, Kyalot said, with the air of someone making a promise they intend to keep under duress. Fine, Orella said. The 9 minutes were not quiet. There was a fight somewhere on the floor below, audible, short, and decisive in the way fights are when one side has a shotgun and the other side has been deprived of its command structure. There was a window somewhere breaking. There were voices, and then there were different voices that were louder and official, and had the specific cadence of law enforcement entry protocol. Then there were a great many voices all at once. Then there was a knock on the radio room door. Police. Any officers in there, identify. Surgeon Orella, badge 4729. Orella called back. Corporal Kyalot, badge 3180, we have a civilian in custody. We're opening the door. He cracked the door. 3 armed officers in tactical gear. Behind them 2 more. The building was full of boots on floors, commands being issued, the particular organized noise of an operation that had arrived with numbers and a plan. The officer at the front of the stack, young, female, the kind of focus that gets people promoted, looked at Orella and then at Kyalot, and then at Avalana sitting in the chair. You want to tell me what happened in this building, she said. Yes, Orella said. It's going to take a while. We've got time, she said. He stepped aside and let them through, and then he stood in the doorway of the radio room and looked at what had been, 3 hours ago, a building on Kalayunzue that nobody who didn't already know would have looked at twice. There were things in this building that were going to require people with different training than his to understand. There were things in this building that would require arguments he'd never had to make in court before. There were things in this building that were going to be in reports that he would file, and that would go up chains, that he would never see the end of. He was already constructing the first paragraph. Kyalot came and stood next to him. They looked at the corridor together, at the organized machinery of an investigation beginning to unspool. "You knew the signal would work," Kyalot said. "I thought it would work," Orella said. "That's not the same thing." "No," Orella said. "It isn't." He thought about this for a moment. "But we were in the building regardless. The signal working or not working didn't change what we had to do while we were in it." "That's a very calm way of looking at it." "It's the only way that works," Orella said. He straightened his jacket. He was going to need a new jacket. He was going to need new knuckles. He was going to need about a week of sleep and approximately 200 mate sessions, and a very long conversation with a very patient attorney about everything he'd seen on the 4th floor. "Are you going to make a statement tonight?" "Yes," Kyalot said. "Good. Don't undersell the 4th floor. Whatever it looked like to you, it looked like that. Put it in exactly the words you used to me. They'll think I'm. Put it in the words you used to me," Orella said again. "Exactly." Kyalot looked at him. "The complaint," he said. "If we both file, we'd have to withdraw them," Orella said. "Both of us, or the case gets complicated." Kyalot was quiet for a moment. The investigation churned around them. Boots, commands, the flicker of flashlights in rooms that hadn't had enough light. "There were things in that room," Kyalot said, "that I've never seen anything like." "Yes," Orella said. "How do you report something you've never seen anything like?" "You describe it," Orella said. "Precisely and without editorializing. You describe what you saw. The color of the tubing, the angle of the figures, the sound the motion made. You put it down and you let the record be the record." "And if no one believes it?" Orella looked at the corridor, at the tactical officers moving carefully through the 4th floor doorway, with their weapons raised and their training running underneath them like a current, at the particular way humans looked when they were doing the thing they'd trained for, under conditions they hadn't trained for, which was how it always worked, which was the only way anything ever got done. "They'll believe it," he said. "They'll believe it because it's in there and they can see it. Truth doesn't need you to sell it. It just needs you to show up." He pushed off the doorframe and walked toward the stairwell, toward the process that was already in motion, toward the long institutional machinery that would turn the next 3 hours into paperwork, and the paperwork into a case, and the case into something that might, in time, become an answer. He passed a junior officer coming up and nodded at her, and she nodded back with the expression of someone who had just seen the 4th floor and hadn't yet figured out what to do with her face about it. He understood the expression. He'd been wearing it himself internally for the last 2 hours. Behind him, Kyalot fell into step. They went down together, the two of them, at the same direction, without discussing it. Outside, the street was lit up blue and red and white. The city was awake and indifferent the way cities are. The building on Calle Unzué was surrounded by law enforcement, and everyone who lived on the block had come to their windows for 30 seconds, and then gone back to whatever they'd been doing. Because the cities had seen things before, the city had seen everything before, and it continued to operate on the logic that it always had, which was the logic of the place itself, stubborn and layered and improbably alive. Orella stopped on the front step and breathed the outdoor air, which smelled like petrol and the river, and the particular mix of the barrio at this hour, and was completely without chemical undertones. A detective he didn't know appeared at his elbow with a notepad. "Sergeant Orella, command wants a preliminary account." "Yes," Orella said. He turned to look at the building one more time. 6 floors of concrete lit up now, active discovered. "Get something to write on that's bigger than that." "Start a new page," Orella said. "This is a long one," he began to talk. Around him, the city continued on its way, indifferent and enormous, and the night continued toward morning, and the preliminary account became a statement, and the statement became a record, and the record went into the machinery that would take it somewhere. Orella couldn't see from here. He was a man who worked by case, by building, by floor, by the evidence available in the room where he found himself. He had found himself in this room. That would have to be enough. 7 weeks later, in a conference room on the 9th floor of a federal building, a prosecutor named Hernandez spread 41 photographs across a table and looked at Orella across them and said, "We want to go up the chain, the way you said. I need to understand everything you saw in that building." Orella looked at the photographs. Some of them he recognized. Some of them were new, developed from evidence he hadn't seen directly. "All right," he said. He settled into the chair. He folded his hands on the table. He was very good at waiting, at the long, patient work of the thing that couldn't be done quickly, and he would do it here the same way he'd done it everywhere else. Precisely, without editorializing, description by description, floor by floor. Kayalot was in the chair beside him. They'd been in the same building for 3 meetings now. They hadn't filed the withdrawals yet. They had, however, had the mate. Twice. The second time, Kayalot had brought his own thermos, and Orella had allowed this without comment, which was as close as either of them came to saying something had changed. From the beginning, Orella said, more to himself than to the prosecutor. He was already running the first paragraph, the loading bay, the smell, the 6 seconds of stillness before he moved. From the beginning, he talked for 4 hours. It was the first time the federal record would contain the phrase biological integration system with an evidence number next to it. It was the first time a witness statement would describe, precisely and without editorializing, the figures in the 4th floor room and the one standing in the corner. It was the first time the chain would have a link at its base that was solid enough to pull from. It would not be the last. When Orella walked out of the federal building into the late afternoon light, the city was doing what the city always did. It was moving, it was arguing, it was eating something from a cart on the corner, it was late for something and early for something else. It was in all the ways that mattered, completely and irreducibly itself. He stood on the top step for a moment and breathed it in. Behind him, Kayalot appeared, jacket over one arm, squinting in the light. So, Kayalot said. So, Orella said. The mate place on Cordoba is still open. Orella looked at the city. He looked at Kayalot. He looked at the city again. All right, he said, and went down the steps. The mate place on Cordoba served it in gourds, the color of old tobacco, with bombillas that were silver-plated and bent at the angle that everyone in the city agreed was correct, without anyone ever having had a meeting about it. Orella drank his without sugar, the way his grandmother had made it, the way the bitter hit the back of the throat and told you it was real. Kayalot added sugar, which Orella noted and declined to mention. They sat at a table near the window and watched the street. 3 months had passed since Kalunzue. The federal case was moving, which meant it was moving slowly, which meant that Orella checked his phone for messages from Hernandez, the way you check a wound to see if it's still there. The chain was being pulled from the base, as he'd said. It moved the way chains move, with resistance, with the weight of everything attached to it, with the occasional lurch, when something gave way that you hadn't expected to give. There had been 17 arrests in the weeks following the building. 12 had been processed through normal channels. 4 had required interpretations of criminal statute that the prosecutor's office was still arguing about. Because the question of what constituted personhood under Argentine law was not a question anyone in the justice system had previously needed to answer in the presence of physical evidence. The 17th arrest was Avelana, who had spent 11 days saying nothing, and then, on the 12th day, had asked for her attorney, and then, with her attorney present, had started talking. She talked the way people talked when they'd done the calculation, and arrived at the only answer that saved them anything. Completely, with dates and names and account numbers, and a precision of recall that told Orella she'd been keeping the records in her head all along. Not on paper, not on servers, in memory. The kind of memory discipline that you didn't see often. The kind that made you understand why she'd been the operational lead. He had filed no report on his impressions of Avelana. Impressions didn't go in reports. But he thought about the way she'd sat in the radio room chair, and the way she'd made her calculation, and the way she'd looked at her hands in her lap. And he thought that somewhere inside the infrastructure of what she'd been doing, there had been a person who was exhausted by it. Not repentant, not reformed, but exhausted in the particular way of someone who had been running a thing that required constant maintenance, and had run it so long that the maintenance had become the whole of their life. He didn't know what to do with that thought. He filed it with the other things he didn't know what to do with, which was a growing category. The 4th floor, Kayalot said. Yes, Orella said. Hernandez showed me the technical assessment from the university team they brought in. I saw the summary, Orella said. Did you understand it? Orella considered. Some of it. The biological component was clearer than the mechanical component. The mechanical component is going to require a set of expert witnesses that nobody has ever had to qualify before. There are precedents, Kayalot said. From other countries, the prosecutor told me. Yes. From other countries, from cases that went on for years and resolved in ways that didn't fully satisfy anyone who brought them. That's the precedent. He drank his mate. But it's a precedent. The street outside had the late afternoon quality that Orella had always liked. The light coming off the buildings at the angle that made the city look older, and also cleaner than it was. The people moving with the particular efficiency of a city population that had learned to walk around each other without drama. Someone was arguing about something 2 tables over, loudly and with hand gestures, and nobody near them was paying attention because that was also how the city worked. "Do you believe in what we do?" Kayalot asked. It was not a question Orella expected from him. It was not the kind of question Kayalot had ever asked in the years they'd worked the same district. It sat on the table between them for a moment. "I believe case is close," Orella said. "Not always, not the way you want them to. But the record gets made, and then the record exists. And then what happens next is what happens. I believe in the record. That's not the same as believing in what we do." "It's the only part of it I can see clearly enough to believe in," Orella said. "The rest is probability." Kayalot looked at him. He had the expression of someone who had arrived at an answer they weren't sure they wanted. "The man on the 4th floor," Kayalot said. "The one standing in the corner. In the technical assessment it says the electrical interruption you caused disrupted the integration signal. It says the tissue damage that resulted was." He stopped. "Yes," Orella said. "Did you know that would happen?" Orella looked at the street. A woman walked past with a dog that was pulling hard towards something it wanted and couldn't reach. The woman corrected it with the automatic fluency of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. "I knew something would happen," he said. "The way the integration worked, the things I'd heard, the informants, the reports from San Telmo, was dependent on a continuous signal. An interruption wouldn't put a person to sleep. It would." He paused. "It would be more final than that, and you did it anyway." "There were 3 people on those tables," Orella said. "Whatever was on the tables, 3 of them were still present in the way that people are present. Still, reachable. The one in the corner had gone somewhere that the integration had." He stopped again. "The assessment confirmed it. The tissue state wasn't compatible with." "I know what it said," Kayalot said. "Then you know I made a judgment," Orella said. "In a room in a building at night with no backup and no warrant, and no guidelines for this specific situation. I made the best judgment I had the information to make." He looked back from the street and met Kayalot's eyes. "If it was wrong, that's in the record too. I didn't hide what I did. I described it precisely and without editorializing, and I let the record be the record." Kayalot held his gaze for a long moment. Then he looked at his mate gourd. He turned it in his hands. The street argued on around them. "The 3 on the tables," he said. "Hernandez told me they're recovering." "Yes," Orella said, slowly. "Yes, it will be a long time before." He stopped. "Yes." Neither of them said anything for a moment. Outside, the city continued its work. "I'm going to withdraw the complaint," Kayalot said. "The one I filed." "I know," Orella said. "I'm withdrawing mine. I thought you would." "Then why say it?" Kayalot looked up. "Because I want it on the record," he said. "Between us, not in a file. I want to say it to your face." Orella looked at him for a long moment. Kayalot was not a man who did things like that often. He was a man who acted and let the actions speak and only came back later, if he came back at all. Orella understood suddenly that he was also, underneath the conduct unbecoming and the negligence charges, and the 3 years of transferred silence, a man who thought about the record, about what stayed, about what the thing was when you stripped the procedures off it. "All right," Orella said. "It's on the record." They drank their mate. The afternoon light kept its angle against the buildings. Hernandez called the following Tuesday. There had been a development. A server had been located. The chain had a new link higher up. There would need to be additional statements. Orella said he would come in Thursday. Hernandez said the university team wanted to talk to him directly, separately from the legal proceedings, just to understand what he'd seen from the vantage point of someone who'd been in the room. Orella said he would do that too. He had learned in 15 years that cases did not end. They changed state. They moved from active to procedural to archived, and sometimes they moved back, and the work you put into them at one stage reappeared at another stage in a different form, the way water moved through a city's systems. Below the surface, through channels you didn't see, present in everything without being visible in anything. He prepared his notes for Thursday the way he always prepared notes. In order from the beginning, each item precise and without editorializing, the loading bay, the smell, the 6 seconds before he moved. He had, since the federal interview, added one item to the notes that he had not included in any formal statement. Because it was an impression, and impressions didn't go in reports. He added it to his personal notes because those were his and the record he kept of his own thinking. And because he was a man who believed in the record in all its forms. The item was this: that the most human thing in that building on that night had not been him or Kyalot, or the armed guards or Avalana in her corner office. It had been the moment when Kyalot, sitting on an overturned plastic crate in a locked room, had chosen to tell the truth about what he'd seen through the glass. He could have said nothing. He could have managed it, described it in safer terms, let Orella form his own impression. Instead, he had said, the eyes were wrong, the faces were wrong, as precisely and without editorializing as he could manage for something that was outside the vocabulary available to him. That was the thing, Orella thought, writing in his careful hand in the margin of his notes. That was the part that stayed. Not the escape from the locked room. Not the circuit board and the copper wire and the 4 minutes of counted delay. Not the radio signal transmitted 3 times on the emergency band. All of those were methods, good methods. Methods that worked because he'd thought them through and applied them under pressure, and he was glad they'd worked and he would use them again. But the thing that stayed was the eyes were wrong. The faces were wrong. A man describing something he couldn't explain, in a locked room in a bad building, in the middle of the night, precisely, and without editorializing, because that was what you did. Because the record needed the truth and the truth needed someone willing to say it in the words it came in, no matter how those words sounded. He capped his pen. Thursday, he would go back in and do it again. Friday, probably the following week when the university team had their session, as many times as the record required, he set the notes on his desk and looked out the window of his apartment at the city, which was doing the city's work in the city's way. Indifferent and enormous and completely committed to its own continuance. He had lived in it his whole life. He trusted it the way you trusted something that had no interest in your trust and kept going regardless. He went to bed and slept without difficulty, which was one of the things he was good at, that people who knew him found surprising. The cases didn't follow him there. They waited on his desk, where he'd left them, patient as the record itself, ready to be picked up in the morning, and worked. In the morning, he picked them up. The university team met him in a room that was trying to be a lab, and not quite succeeding. White surfaces, good lighting, equipment that belonged in a hospital on one bench, and equipment that belonged in an engineering workshop on another. 3 researchers, 2 of whom had the distracted energy of people who had been thinking too hard about one thing for too long. The third, Dr. Linares, did not have that energy. She had the steady focus of someone who had already processed the shock and arrived at curiosity. She showed him photographs, not from the case, from the technical assessment, diagrams, cross-sections, models. We want to understand the operational logic from your perspective, she said, not the technical side, the human side. She paused, the way it felt in the room. It felt like a building where something had gone wrong for a long time, Orella said, and the people in the building had accommodated the wrongness so that it became the operating condition. She nodded. She was writing. The figures on the tables, he said, appeared to me to be present, aware, unable to communicate that awareness in any conventional way. Whether that was a function of the integration process or a function of their medical state, I can't assess. What I can tell you is that the assessment I made at the time was that they were still reachable, and I made my decisions accordingly. The assessment was correct, she said, as far as we can determine. Good, he said. He looked at the diagrams on her desk. The cross-sections meant something to her that they didn't mean to him, and he was comfortable with that. Different people carried different parts of the record. His part was the room, the smell, the 6 seconds before he moved. He would carry that part as precisely and without editorializing as he could manage. And she would carry her part, and somewhere in the combination of all the parts, carried by all the people who'd been in the chain, the picture would be complete enough to work from. Can I ask you something, she said. Yes, Orella said. When you crossed the circuit, when you caused the interruption, you knew what the likely result would be for the one in the corner. I knew there would be a result, he said. I made the judgment that it was the necessary result. How? She wasn't challenging him. She was genuinely asking. How do you make that judgment? He thought about it carefully, because it deserved care. You have information, he said. It's never complete. It's never the information you would choose. You have what you have in the room, in the time available. You look at what's in front of you, and you make the best determination you can about which direction produces the most good for the most people who are still reachable. Then you act on it. He paused. And then you put it in the record. Every part of it. Because the record is how the next person does it better. Dr. Linares looked at him for a moment. One of the other researchers had stopped typing and was looking at him too. That's a very clear way of putting it, she said. It's the only way that works, he said. He took the metro home. He stood in the car with the city moving around him. The particular compressed intimacy of the city in transit. Everyone going somewhere else. The collective, purposeful motion of a population that had been navigating this place for 150 years and had developed the instincts for it the way you developed instincts for anything you did long enough. He looked at his reflection in the dark window and looked away. In his jacket pocket was a copy of the first paragraph of his preliminary statement, the one he'd given to the young officer on the front steps of the building on Calle Unzu A, which Hernandez had included in the case file, and which the university team had asked about, and which had been, according to Hernandez, the clearest single description of what had been happening in that building that anyone had yet produced. He took it out and read it on the metro because there was nothing else in his hands to do. And he read it the way he read all his own work, looking for what was imprecise, what was editorialized, what could be clearer. He found two things. He folded the copy back into his pocket and made a note of them in the margins of his mind. He would correct them when he got home. He would put them in the record. He would do this because the record required it, and because the case required the record, and because somewhere at the top of a chain that was being pulled from the base, in a building or a room or a server or a conversation he would never see directly, someone else would need those two corrections to do their part of the work. He got off at his stop. The city let him out into the evening. He went home and sat at his desk and opened his notes and made the corrections in his careful hand, and then he closed the notes and set them ready for Thursday. Outside, the city worked on.